Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Welcome to Compass here live on Quotidiano TV today in Bucharest. Today with a very special guest from Italy today with Professor Valentina Giuffra from the University of Pisa. Welcome to Compass. How are you doing?
Thank you for inviting me. I am a professor of history of medicine and paleopathology. That is, we study the history of treatments, the history of discoveries in medicine, and also the effect of disease in ancient bodies. We study, in particular, skeletons from from archaeological excavations, and also mummy, to explore the patterns of past diseases in ancient populations.
And I think you're also the director of the Museum of Paleontological Anatomy of the University of Pisa.
Yeah, we have a small museum, but very precious because we host hundreds of specimens consisting in pathological organs preserved in alcohol, which can show the effects of different diseases on our internal organs. And so it can be useful also for students of medicines, and also these collections have an historical value because some of them are very ancient and are dated back to the second half of the 19th century. And so this museum has a long history, and so we are proud of our treasures.
And which exactly is, please, your area of research?
Exactly, it is paleopathology. That is, we study past diseases in ancient human remains, in particular skeletons. We examine hundreds of skeletons in our laboratory, coming from different geographical areas and from different historical periods, and also mummies, natural or also artificial mummies, to investigate the evidence of diseases in human bodies.
Have you ever come across in your research with ancient pandemics, where we say that these skeletons, for instance, were actually passed away because of a pandemic like the Cyprianic pandemic or another, the Great Plague in Athens? Have you ever come in touch with such skeletons?
Yeah, because I have studied in particular a cemetery from Sardinia, dated back to the modern age, the second half of the 16th century, and we have a test of historical written records that in that period there was a pandemic of plague, and in fact we found multiple burials, and we investigated as remains which are referable to a plague pandemic of modern age.
And do you have colleagues, let's say physicians from nowadays, who have the curiosity in asking you about your opinion, how certain plagues have developed or what might have been the cause of the plague? Is such an interdisciplinary dialogue usual or rather less usual between scientists?
The attention for past pandemics is increased a lot in the last decades in the field of paleopathology. And there are several researchers in Europe and also in the United States who focused on this particular field of research, not the University of Pisa in detail. And I know that also for modern medicine, for current medicine, these researches are very important because we can understand better the evolution of past pathogens, or pathogens which are modern and which are present also in current times. And so it is important to understand the evolution of pathogens through through millennia, through history, to in some way to predict the future evolutions of important pathogens, which are very, very demanding for modern medicine. For example, plague was one of the diseases better investigated in paleopathology. So in my opinion, there was a good interaction between past pandemics and past studies and modern medicine.
And particularly in paleopathology, which is the role, take for instance, while my knowledge is not that wide in this area, which role plays Hippocrates? What can you tell us about Hippocrates and at which extent his research and his contribution to modern medicine is still relevant nowadays? I read a paper published by your institute, the Institute of Paleopathologia of the University of Pisa, called Discovery of the First Hippocratic Cranial Trepanation from the Greek colony of Himera, Sicily, 6th to the 5th century before Christ.
So Hippocrates is considered the father of modern medicine because before Hippocrates, probably there were physicians and possibly someone wrote some texts, but they are not arrived to us. And on the contrary, the treatises, the works of Hippocrates arrived to us and were transcribed through centuries. And because Hippocrates covered several topics in medicine, and so he fixed for the first time medicine in a written form, because probably before Hippocrates, medicine was transmitted, the knowledge about medicine was transmitted orally. So, in fact, my research group examined in particular a case of cranial trepanation contemporary to the period in which Hippocrates lived, and performed with an instrument which can be identified with the trepanon described by Hippocrates in his texts.
And what was the reason Hippocrates used the Prion to trepanate the skull? So, do we know anything about the disease which he tried to cure by using the Prion?
Sure. In his text entitled On Injuries of the Head, which is a text focused on cranial anatomy and head trauma, Hippocrates recommends the use of trepanation to treat some types of cranial trauma, because Hippocrates distinguished several types of cranial traumas depending on the type of wound, the presence of a fracture or not, the presence of a contusion or not, etc. And so in this treatise, he describes the different types of trauma and also prescribes the different management for each type of traumas. So, for example, trepanation is suggested for fissured fractures, for bone contusion with or without associated fracture, and for example, for fracture which involves the suture of the skull. And so it describes in detail which is the management and the post-operative treatment.
And how many different trepanation tools Hippocrates was using?
In substance, Hippocrates describes several instruments. For example, one of the most important is the trepanon, because before the period of Hippocrates, before the work of Hippocrates, The most diffused technique to perform trepanation was scraping. That is the use of a sort of raspatory, an instrument, which was scraped and scraped several times on the cranial surface until a perforation was obtained. This is a very ancient technique because the trepanation is considered the most ancient surgical procedure because a lot of cases were found before, dated back to the period before Hippocrates. In truth, the most ancient cases are dated back to the Mesolithic times, with an increase of cases after the Neolithic period. But after Hippocrates, a new instrument was introduced, that is the trepan. In particular, Hippocrates
Is this the Prion? The Prion?
Yeah, because there are two types of trepanon described by Hippocrates. One is the trepan, which is an instrument made by a perforator, which was rotated using the string of a bow, and which created a circular opening on the skull, and then the serrated trepanon, which is named in Greek Prion, which was a metallic and cylindrical instrument with a crowned diameter, a
crown drill bit
surface, yeah, which was rotated on the skull surface until a bone disc could be extracted from the skull. And this particular type of trepanon, the Prion, was particularly prescribed when the surgical intervention by a surgeon was postponed to the time of the injury. That is, when some time was passed after the injury. In this case, a more invasive intervention was necessary because usually Hippocrates suggested to not perforate the bone in all the thickness, so that is to not arrive with the trepanon until the meninges, because the meninges could be damaged. But if some time passed after the injury, in particular 3 days, in this case the surgeon should use the Prion, and the Prion could perforate the bone in all the thickness. And in this case, the use of a probe was necessary. The probe was a sort of sound to assess the depth of the hole, to check the depth of the perforation, to avoid damages to the meninges.
So quite a complicated intervention.
Yeah. Yeah, but the intervention was successful in the majority of cases. We know this from paleopathology because tens of cases of trepanations were investigated, was found in skeletal remains, and in the majority of cases the patient survived to the intervention, because if the surgeon was skillful and avoided to touch and to damage directly the structures underlying the bone, that is the meninges and the brain, there were good probabilities to survive.
Were trepanations also recommended in case of the, let's call it, sleeping sickness? I suggested you a paper written by Sir Arthur McNulty in 1937, and there he describes encephalitis lethargica, which is a neurological disease, maybe following the Spanish flu. And McNulty, but also Oliver Sacks, the famous author of the book Awakenings, he says that the sleeping sickness had been described also by Hippocrates. Was this sleeping sickness also one of the reasons why trepanation had been used, or we don't know anything about that?
There are no such precise indication in this sense because it is difficult to identify a disease so peculiar and to find evidence of this disease described by Hippocrates. So definitely, I'm not sure that Hippocrates prescribed also in this case trepanation. He recommended especially for cranial trauma.
But he did not, just as a matter of fact, he did not just retain to human beings. He also, I think, cured animals, also sheep and cattle. So he investigated not just human beings in his research. Hippocrates.
I don't know this attention for animals. Galen was made investigation on animals, but I don't know if Hippocrates investigated also animals. In this treatment, in this treatise on the injuries of the head, he speaks only about humans.
Yeah. No, because I remember I have written somewhere that sheep suffering of scrapie had been trepanated, and that he also described, maybe that was wrong, and that he described the spongiform brain of people suffering.
I don't know this.
Yeah.
I don't know this. Please don't put
no
this
worries,
in the
no worries.
recording.
I mean, we are supposed to talk about the trepanation.
Nothing. Yeah.
So Hippocrates, he was the first to actually invent this crown drill bit. So his performance was to create an instrument.
Yeah, we usually call it the Hippocratic trepanum is named by the name of Hippocrates because this invention was attributed to Hippocrates. We don't know if Hippocrates was inspired by other medical texts. We don't know because no medical text antecedent to the period of Hippocrates arrived to us, but the trepanum is attributed to him.
Yeah, and Prion, I have written, means a prion is in Greek a saw. So it's also a Greek word, the prion. But what is funny in nowadays modern medicine, a prion is a protein. It's an infectious protein which induces neurodegenerative disease. The name, it's responsible for the spongiform brain. It's making vacuoles in the brain and describes the spongiform brain. The discoverer of this proteinaceous infectious agent, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Stanley Prusiner, he declares 2018 in an interview published in World Neurology with Professor Lanska. The interview is called Stanley Prusiner on the Origin of the Term Prion. He also received in 1997 the Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology for this discovery. And he pretends that he gives the name to this protein prion, and this is his own work creation. Now, the funny thing is the coincidence in history. Now, we have a protein making holes in the brain, having the same name like Hippocrates' trepanation instrument. So in both cases, we have an instrument and a protein induces somewhere lesions to the brain or skull. Do you think from an ethical point of view, should we maybe look for a more fortunate name for the prion protein? There are millions of people suffering of prion disease. We can't say that they suffer of a hole in the skull because of the trepanation instrument, can't we?
I imagine, I can suppose that the inventor of the prion of the neurological disease was influenced unconsciously by the work of Hippocrates, by his old knowledge, and
he had no idea.
No idea, we don't know, but it is highly suggestive. I think there is a relationship, a sort of link between the two words.
He says that he intended to have an acronym for proteinaceous infectious agent. And then, I don't want to be mistaken, ladies and gentlemen, you should all verify the sources. What he says about the Prion, proteinaceous infectious agent, Pia, you added an F. And then Prusina said, so you just underline the F in infectious, right? That's where the letters all come from. I always liked Edith Piaf. She adopted the stage name Piaf from her nickname, which is French slang for sparrow. Now, sparrow is announcing all of this, right? I sent to a friend of mine named Sidney Underfriend, an American biochemist and pharmacologist who was running the Roche Institute of Molecular Biology. This was a fabulous place that was created by Roche to do basic science that would create drugs. Eventually, they all shut it all down because they never got a drug on the spending, and so further and so on. Short, you need something short. So he then agreed upon the name Prion. He said it was his invention. At no stage, Professor Prusina ever referred to Hippocrates. I contacted him. I sent him twice an invitation to the interview, and even asking him about this unfortunate coincidence. No response. It's funny because, you know, names in medicine sometimes change. The swine flu had changed because the swine flu affected people, some people in their beliefs. Nowadays, scientists talk about the name change of the monkeypox, which is unethical. Could someone suffering of a Prion disease, we have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, we have Parkinson disease, corona is partly linked with Prion disease. These people suffering of Prion disease, we can't say about them that they have a hole in the skull.
This is very strange.
But,
I don't know how to explain this.
Yeah, but I mean, the etymology of the name raises some ethical questions because the inventor, the discoverer of the protein, is not making the connection to Hippocrates. He makes the connection to Edith Piaf and says it is his word creation. I can live with that.
I cannot solve the problem, but he was influenced by his previous knowledges and he did not remember this, possibly. We don't
Possibly.
know.
I will launch an initiative for an ethical review of the term prion in case of neurodegenerative disease, because it is such a nowadays inflationary term which should not be used, associated with a trepanation instrument. It's somehow sad. Would you support such an initiative? Listen, if there would be, for instance, let's say 10,000, I'm just kidding, 10,000 scientists saying, we proposed a name of a flower or of a bird for a disease, for ethical name.
It's not my
it's not your duty. I understand that. Yeah, I understand. No, just kidding. I'd also like to ask you, please, this trepanation technique Hippocrates was using. What did he know, or what was he informed by much older trepanation techniques? How familiar was he with, let's say, Babylonic in Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt and their trepanations?
We don't know because we don't have text, unless a very short text or other kind of text before the period of Hippocrates, we know that the trepanation was a very ancient technique. So this was transmitted through centuries and through millennia, because the first cases are dated back to the Mesolithic times, 10,000 before Christ, before present. So probably Hippocrates learned the technique from other physicians because it was a very diffused practice. It is attested in all continents, especially in South America and in Europe, especially in Europe. So we don't know from where Hippocrates was learned this technique. We cannot have any idea about this.
Was it
But
always
this
a
was a very
medical
ancient
application?
technique.
Was it always, sorry, a medical application? Or we
No.
also have, let's say, a mystical use where people might have believed that accessing a higher level of spirituality, trepanation was needed?
There are two main reasons for which trepanation was performed in the past. One was a medical reason, that is to treat some diseases, in particular cranial trauma, as Hippocrates explained. But there is also probably a mystic, a religious, a spiritual reason, because probably some diseases were attributed, for example, to the intervention of evil spirits, to the gods, and it was important to perform a hole in the head to let the spirits leave the person affected. And so there was also, for sure, a symbolic reason for trepanation, and this is attested also in historical times. For example, in the famous painting, the extraction of the stone of madness by Hieronymus Bosch represents a scene of trepanation to let get out from the head the stone of madness. So this reason for trepanation was diffused. Think about all the psychiatric diseases, neurological diseases, which do not leave any evidence in the skeletons, but which were present in the past, and probably past physicians wanted to treat also these types of disturbances with trepanation.
It is interesting. I read somewhere that there is even nowadays a trepanation association in the world, where you have actually physically healthy people, but maybe from a psychiatric point of view, unhealthy people who voluntarily trepanate themselves in order to attain a higher level of spirituality. I mean, that was one of the most appalling things which I've ever read.
Yeah. Trepanation was performed since contemporary times, for example, from African tribes. And I've read some cases in Western countries, in advanced Western countries, in which some people performed the trepanation on themselves. These are social phenomena which have a very ancient origin.
Professor Lieberman, he is one of the very famous and distinguished etymologists at the University of Oxford. He's an expert in Germanic mythology. And he published 2 papers, which also, ladies and gentlemen, I recommend you. And there he refers to the Greek Prion, how it proliferated via India into Scandinavia, and how the Prion there turned into a weapon. And it's funny, this weapon, it changed the name, he explains, into Nauger or Auger. Now, in German, Auge means eye. Auger was the Germanic, almost the same word. was the hole which this weapon made. So the weapon was like the Prion to trepanate. And later it became the awl and was a trepanation instrument with which Loki, he, I think, was one of Odin's sons, got punished and was silenced with the Prion. So in German mythology, we have the Prion as an instrument to enforce silence on someone who is talking too much. So the connection, we have Hippocrates with a medical instrument, and we have a Germanic weapon inducing silence. Both connotations are not the best connotations for a severe disease nowadays to be a synonym of it. And I think this is something we should maybe in future look like, because ethical considerations and the power of words really matter. It is not that Prion would mean in a different language something like bread or car or flour. It's from the same complex of understanding and of the same meaning. Prion disease create cognitive decline. Prion disease create neurodegenerative decay. But you made a great contribution with providing us such a precious and really valuable background information about the first Prion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It was a pleasure to have you today here in Compass. And I promise you to update you regularly on our efforts to work on finding a new term for the Prion, but not for yours. We will not change history. We will look at a protein with the same name. Thank you very much, and my greetings to Pisa.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
the
Bye.
best. Bye.
Bye.